In 1750, Lisbon was a colossal, decaying titan of the Atlantic, a city of staggering verticality and visceral, atmospheric heaviness, where the glittering gold of an overseas empire was physically crushed against the suffocating, bone-deep squalor of a medieval urban nightmare. Before the 1755 earthquake would act as a divine scythe to erase this version of the city, Lisbon was a sprawling, jagged landscape of 7 limestone hills that seemed to groan under the weight of its own architectural contradictions. The air was a thick, stagnant miasma, a nauseating symphony of rotting Atlantic cod, the metallic tang of Tejo River silt, the sweet, heavy drift of Brazilian tobacco, and the stifling, omnipresent incense of 1,000 Baroque altars that sat like golden jewels inside damp, crumbling stone walls. Lisbon in 1750 was not merely a city. It was a sprawling, suffocating monument to the collision between celestial wealth and terrestrial decay. Perched upon 7 jagged limestone hills that seemed to groan under the weight of their own history, the Portuguese capital functioned as the beating, gilded heart of a global empire that stretched from the spice-laden coasts of Malabar to the gold-rich mountains of Minas Gerais. Yet for the nearly 250,000 souls who inhabited this labyrinth of stone and shadow, the grandeur of the overseas colonies was nothing more than a distant rumor, masked by the visceral, bone-deep squalor of a medieval urban nightmare that was about to be erased by the divine scythe of the 1755 earthquake. The topography of terror and triumph. The city's very geography served as a brutal social map. To the west lay the high, sun-drenched districts of Chiado and Bairro Alto, where the aristocracy paraded in silk brocades and powdered wigs, breathing the relatively clean Atlantic air. But to the east, the districts of Alfama and Moraria plunged into the damp, lightless valleys, forming a claustrophobic maze of leaning tenements and lightless alleys known as bicos. Here the houses were stacked so precariously that the eaves of opposite buildings nearly touched, creating a permanent subterranean gloom where the sun never reached the cobblestones. The streets were not paved with stone, but with a thick, slippery layer of animal offal, kitchen scraps, and open sewage that ran in black gutters directly toward the Tejo River. The air of Lisbon in 1750 was a heavy, stagnant miasma. It was a nauseating symphony of smells that defined the era. The sharp, pungent tang of drying Atlantic cod, bacalhau, the metallic scent of river mud at low tide, the sweet, cloying drift of Brazilian tobacco, and the stifling, omnipresent aroma of frankincense drifting from 1,000 Baroque altars. This incense served a dual purpose: spiritual devotion and the practical need to mask the stench of death and decay that haunted the crowded valleys. The desperate life of the pobre. The inhabitants of the lower depths, known as the descamisados, the shirtless, and the pobre, lived in a state of terminal, ragged desperation. Their clothing was a tragedy of textiles, a literal mosaic of survival. They wore trapos, rags of coarse, unbleached hemp and heavy gray wool that had been mended so many times with scrap fabric, sailcloth, and burlap that the original garment had vanished beneath layers of gray filth and river salt. For a dock worker at the Cais de Ribeira, a shirt was a luxury. Most worked bare-chested, their skin tanned to the texture of scorched leather by the relentless Iberian sun. Their woolen breeches were often stiff with dried salt and grease, held together by hempen rope instead of leather belts. The women of the slums faced an even more rhythmic, agonizing labor. Their hands were raw, red, and swollen from scrubbing the laundry of the wealthy in the brackish, icy waters of the Tejo. They were draped in heavy, multi-layered skirts of coarse baize that soaked up the street filth like a wick, making their movements slow and heavy. To protect themselves from the Atlantic gales that whipped up the hills, they wrapped themselves in greasy, soot-stained shawls, lenços. These women were the city's invisible spine, carrying massive woven baskets of salt cod atop their heads, their voices joining a chaotic urban chorus of cries, prayers, and curses. Inside their hovels, the conditions were even grimmer. Many families lived in single-room lojas, ground-floor cells, carved into ancient Roman or Moorish walls. These spaces were lightless and windowless, with walls that perpetually wept saltpeter, a damp white crust that clung to the hair and lungs of the inhabitants. The air inside stayed perpetually cold and humid, fostering a constant, hacking cough among the children who played on dirt-packed floors shared with goats or stray dogs. The Tejo, a forest of mass and misery. The Tejo River was the city's lifeblood and its open grave. In 1750, it was a dense, swaying forest of wooden masts, a global graveyard of maritime ambition. Massive Portuguese galleons, heavy with Brazilian bullion and Indian diamonds, sat alongside Dutch merchantmen and English frigates. The riverbank was a chaotic theater of labor, where thousands of barefoot laborers hauled crates of Malabar pepper and sacks of sugar under the indifferent gaze of royal guards in polished breastplates. The sailors who manned these ships, a cosmopolitan mix of Africans, Indians, and Europeans, mingled in the lightless taverns of the Barro Alto. These men roamed the streets with bleeding gums and sunken eyes, the marks of scurvy and long voyages. They traded stories of Amazonian gold and shipwrecks over cups of cheap sour wine, oblivious to the fact that they were mere cogs in a machine that built palaces of ivory for a king they would never see. Religion and the shadow of the Inquisition, religion in 1750, Lisbon was not merely a spiritual practice. It was a crushing, omnipresent atmosphere of divine terror and social control. The shadow of the Inquisition loomed over every plaza like a physical weight. The black-robed Dominican friars moved through the crowds like the secret police of God, their presence enough to silence a bustling tavern in a heartbeat. The scent of burning oak from the auto da fe ceremonies in the Rocio Square was a visceral, recurring sensory trauma, signaling the public burning of heretics and the absolute power of the church over the human soul. Every corner of the city was punctuated by stone shrines to the Virgin Mary. At night, these shrines provided the only meager illumination in a city that descended into a pitch-black abyss. The flickering Miltilovci oil lamps cast long, terrifying shadows of stray dogs and huddling Talanchalar beggars against the wet stone of the great cathedrals. Faith was the only solace for the starving, yet it was also the hand that kept them in the mud. The Great Divide, gold versus grime. The social divide in Lisbon was so profound, it felt like a geographical chasm. A nobleman could look down from his high, sunlit balcony in Chiado, decorated with expensive blue and white tiles, azulejos, and see a world of yurtik yamok, tattered misery just a few feet below in the shadows. The royal treasury groaned under the weight of gold from the mines of Minas Gerais, enough to build sculptures of spun sugar for a single royal banquet. Yet the city could not provide clean water for its dying children. Water was a precious, contested resource. With no fresh springs, the city relied on the Vera de Pozzo system, complex underground cisterns where rainwater was filtered through sandpits. The Galician water carriers, chafaris, were a constant sight, climbing the hills with heavy barrels on their backs.